Now let's look in on the Northern Plains and the Lakota Alliance and see how the 1870s were working for them. When last we checked on them, the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 had ended Red Cloud's War, and it had been ended in a good way for the Lakota, particularly. As you will recall, there had been some conflict over territory between the Lakota and the Crow. Well, this is how it shook out. There was a new Crow reservation boundary was drawn. The Great Sioux Reservation, there in green, was established. And notice there's a region to the west of the Great Sioux Reservation called unceded Indian Territory. Now, that land is not part of the reservation, but it's still Indian territory. It's Indian land. It is where the Lakota were allowed to continue operating and hunting. A lot of the Lakota bands did in fact move onto the Great Sioux Reservation, but many did not. Many chose instead to live out there in that unceded territory where they didn't have to answer to U.S. government officials in any way whatsoever. By the way, that Great Sioux Reservation was eventually broken into several smaller reservations. So there's a bunch of Sioux reservations now, but that had originally been the concentration of them. Okay, now remember that part about unceded Indian territory. That's territory that they never gave up in a treaty, even though it's not part of the reservation. Remember that because that is going to be significant when we get to the 21st century, believe it or not. Well, that's how things were left. How are things going by the 1870s? The story of the Northern Plains in the 1870s is going to be very closely interconnected with the story of railroads, particularly the Northern Pacific Railway Company, Northern Pacific Railroad. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, with the Union Pacific there in blue and the Central Pacific there in red, meeting up in 1869, halfway there at the halfway point. And the goal of the Northern Pacific Railway, established in 1870, the following year, was to do the same thing farther north, obviously, to connect the Great Lakes with the Pacific coast on a rail line that would go through the Northern Plains. This route that you see in the picture is the railroad as it would eventually be. It would take a while. It would, in fact, take the better part of a decade, although there's a pretty significant work stoppage due to a financial panic, but we'll get to that in a moment. So anyway, started in 1870 on the Pacific northwestern coast there, and started building eastward. And it was about 3 years, the summer of 1873, when they reached Lakota territory. Now, you have to stop for a moment and consider the far-reaching implications of a railroad like this. For one thing, the government had been selling or providing railroad companies with land to build these tracks because it was viewed as a good financial investment for the country, infrastructure. And that's exactly why it was bad for the tribes who were in the way, because it was going to bring a lot more people. Not only due to the fact that, people can get on a train and ride, but also due to the fact that people can now acquire land in far-flung places where they can do farming or where they can establish mines and have railroads close by to take those products out. So that's going to attract more farmers, more miners, and more towns, and so on and so forth. Also, you have to take into account the fact that this wasn't really part of that whole we can build forts stuff that was in the original 1851 treaty. It could very easily be argued by the tribes that the government had absolutely no authority to be disposing of their land like this or providing their land to the railroads. But that's not going to stop the railroads. That's not going to stop progress, in air quotes. That's not going to stop the advancing of commercial interests. So, when they had reached as far as what is now Bismarck, North Dakota, and were preparing to go a little bit further, and let me take this opportunity to correct myself. I misspoke just a minute ago. They had actually started in the Great Lakes and were building westward. So they went through the Dakota Territory, what is now North Dakota first, before they got to what is now Montana. So as they were nearing what is now Montana, and they were needing to scout out ahead so that they could be planning on how to go about laying the next part of track, anticipating that there might be problems with Indians, as there in fact had been with the Cheyenne when the Union Pacific was going through their territory farther to the south around 1867. The U.S. government sent out an army contingent to do the mapping and surveying. This contingent was about 1,300 men. It was a mixed group of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Overall command was held by Colonel David Stanley of the 22nd Infantry. Second in command behind him was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer of the 7th Cavalry. Where have we heard of him? So they entered into the area and immediately aroused the attention and the ire of the Lakotas in the region, particularly the Hunkpapa band, through whose immediate territory they were traveling, and all their allies. And here are some of the leaders of those allies. First of all, Fizi or Gall, who was a Hunkpapa leader. He had gained his name when he had eaten the gall out of an animal that he had killed. Also, a Hunkpapa leader named Itomagachu, or Rain in the Face, and he had gotten his name. A couple of conflicting stories. One story was that it was spatters of blood on his face after a fight that looked like red rain. And then another story is that he had been fighting some enemies in a heavy rainfall and his war paint had been all streaked by the rain. Either way, Rain in the Face, that was his name. Then we've got Tatanka Iotake, alias Sitting Bull, which in Lakota is Tatanka Iotake. I've got his picture a little bit bigger than the others because his presence is a little bit larger. Sitting Bull, you're all familiar with already, although this is the first time he's entering into our narrative right here. He was also the leader of a Hunkpapa group, a village, and he was a medicine man, a spiritual guide, as well as a leader. He had been involved with his followers in Red Cloud's war, but we didn't talk about him specifically there. because he wasn't involved in a major way, the way that Crazy Horse was. And there's Crazy Horse. He was leading a group of Oglala Lakotas that were allied with Sitting Bull and these others. The picture there is not an accurate, perfect photograph, because as far as we know, there are no photographs of Crazy Horse. There are several photographs people claim to be of him, but no one can prove the veracity of any of them. They all have various problems of one kind or another. So I took instead a picture from of an actor playing Crazy Horse in a documentary on AMC. Now, in addition, there were also some Minneconjou Lakota and some Cheyenne that were a part of the overall group that was in the area there where Stanley and Custer's soldiers were doing their surveying. On August the 4th, 1873, Custer, with about 100 men, had scouted ahead of the main body of the Army group, there near the area in the map with the circle that says Honsinger Bluff. Although there was no such place at that time called Honsinger Bluff, it was called the Yellowstone Hill. It was not a particularly noteworthy hill yet. It would be by the end of that day. Anyhow, they caught sight of a small number of warriors just a ways ahead of them, and so they gave chase. Whenever the army detail would slow down, the Indians would slow down, and then they would speed back up when Custer sped back up, almost as if they didn't want to lose them, and they wanted them to keep up the chase. Gee, that sounds like the sort of thing Crazy Horse had been known to do. Well, Custer kept chasing them, and they went past a wooded area, and turned out that wooded area concealed about 200 or 300 more warriors. And so there was a fight that started immediately. Custer had his men circle up near a dry creek bed and try to hold off the attacking Indians. And the fighting kept up for over 3 hours. And this was happening on a particularly hot August day. Reportedly, the temperature was around 110 degrees, which makes for some pretty hot fighting. Just a little farther downriver from where all the fighting was going on, right there at that bluff, there were 4 members of Custer's party that had gone out ahead of the Custer party there to water their horses, and they were headed back toward the sound of the shooting to see what was going on. And they were ambushed at the hill by Rain in the Face and 5 of his warriors. The 4 individuals included one civilian merchant, a sutler, who traveled along with the soldiers and, was there to sell various goods. Two privates, and John Honsinger, originally from Germany, who was the chief veterinarian of the 7th Cavalry. So they were rushing back to see what was going on. They got ambushed. 3 of the 4 were killed, including Honsinger and the sutler, and one of the 2 troopers. The 4th trooper managed to escape and made his way east, where he caught up with the larger body and informed them that Custer was under attack. So the rest of the group, several hundred more troopers, came barreling in just as Custer had ordered his men to mount up and countercharge against the attacking Indians. And the troopers and the Indians were both just fighting a lot more slowly after 3 hours in the hot sun, and so everybody was pretty well prepared to lay off the fighting for a while. So the warriors retreated, having lost 5 of their number, and 11 troopers had been killed. Well, 11 people. They weren't all troopers. One of them was a veterinarian, and the other was essentially a salesman. So, to this day, that bluff is known, it's remembered by the name of that veterinarian. A week later, at the mouth of the Bighorn River at a place called Peace Bottom, there was another skirmish. This time, Custer had 8 companies of the 7th Cavalry with him, so about 450 men total. They had camped for the night, and somewhere between 800 to 1,000 warriors descended upon them at dawn. The fighting was not anywhere near as thick or sustained as that earlier skirmish. In fact, there was only one trooper was killed, and then a first lieutenant was permanently disabled from a wound that he received. After that, that was on August the 11th. They continued their survey, and by September, they were out of the area. On the map there's a place called Pryor Circle. That's not really related to this stuff. That's the site of a very bloody battle between the Lakotas and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies and the Crow Indians back in 1861. Well, what came of all this? Not anything immediately, because the railroad, the building of the railroad was suspended for a while because of the Panic of 1873, when essentially the economy tanked. Around the same time, the Credit Mobilier scandal that involved several railroads and corruption led to a lot of focus on railroad owners, and a lot more lost government revenue. So the building of the railroad didn't resume until several years later, after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which is going to come about 3 years after this. But that panic, that economic panic, is going to set events in motion that are going to lead to that famous final confrontation between Custer and Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse 3 years later. How, you ask? Well, the United States was on the gold standard then and for a very long time thereafter. What that means is that every piece of paper money that was printed, for every piece of paper money, every denomination, there had to be an equal amount of gold in the national treasury. All right? So in order to introduce more money into the economy, which is one of the things that governments want to do during a depression, well, they couldn't do that without more gold. And there had been rumors that the Paha Sapa, the Black Hills that were sacred to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho and other tribes, and which had been promised in that 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, it had been promised that these would not be disturbed, but there had been rumors there was gold in them there hills. So President Grant authorized a scientific expedition, if you will, a covert scientific expedition to to survey in the area of the Black Hills to see if there was gold, because, boy, was there a huge need for it at that particular moment in time. Who did he put in charge? Why, none other than Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Now, according to all the treaties, the U.S. government did not have the authority to go poking around looking for gold on Indian lands. According to the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, though, they did have the authority to build forts if they were needed. So that was the cover for this expedition. Custer, theoretically, was out there scouting the area for potentially building a new fort. But he and his surveyors, when they got there, discovered that, in fact, there was gold. Now, he was supposed to be discreet about his findings and report them back to the president, at which point decisions could be made about what was going to be done. But Custer, being Custer, instead he talked to the newspapers. And next thing you know, the rush was on, and miners came pouring into this area, the area of the sacred Black Hills, faster than you could shake them off, as it were. And this was a violation of the treaty on the part of the United States. At this point, just in this course, we have seen this story play out more than once already. We know what happens when gold gets discovered on Indian lands. And this is just talking about on the northern plains. Okay, so if we were looking at a course about Native American history all over the continental United States, there'd be a whole lot more incidents of this. But you have an idea what's going to happen. For one thing, whole new towns sprang up practically overnight in the in the Lakota territory. Towns like Deadwood, wild, unruly towns, because this was not yet an organized federal territory. So there was not a lot of law enforcement other than whatever they could come up with locally. Deadwood is perhaps most famous, aside from being the HBO TV series, which I highly recommend, but most famous for being the place where famous gunfighter Wild Bill Hickok was murdered while playing poker in 1876. Now, I said there wasn't a whole lot of law enforcement. The best you could hope for usually was the U.S. Army, because of course they clearly had military jurisdiction because they had already been running around out there. The fact is, at first, President Grant authorized the use of the Army to arrest trespassers onto the Indian lands, but upon arresting them, all they could really do was escort them back out of the Indian lands and turn them loose, at which point they promptly turned right around and went back. Because, why? Gold. That's why. There was no way to keep those people out of there. It became evident by 1876, it became evident there was no way to keep this flood of miners out of that area unless you shot a few or hanged a few of them. And I want you to be fully aware that in no way would I ever even begin to suspect that the United States government would actually authorize the killing of its own citizens in an election year, which is what 1876 was. Grant wasn't running for re-election. He had served his 2 terms, but certainly was hoping that his party, the Republican Party, would be able to carry it. And it turned out it was a really, really close election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. So anyway, nope, can't go shooting citizens on an election year. So what the heck are you going to do? There was really not much at this point that Grant saw he could do. other than just kind of throw up his hands and stand aside and watch it happen. And happen it did as more miners came pouring in violation of the treaty. And you know what kind of manners they had. You know what kind of attitudes they had. They weren't supposed to be there to begin with. And you know what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that the Lakotas and their allies are going to start killing them. And they did. And when that happened, then the United States Army did feel justified in stepping in an election year. And so they did. Remember I said that some Lakotas came into the Great Sioux Reservation and stayed there, and others, a minority, decided instead to remain out there in those unceded lands hunting buffalo. Well, roughly about two-thirds of them went in there to the Great Sioux Reservation, which was divided into three agencies. An agency was basically the government set up to distribute annuities and to do administration and so forth. There was the Red Cloud Agency, the Spotted Tail Agency, both named for their leaders, with the Red Tail Agency having the mostly Ogalallas, and the Spotted Tail Agency having mostly the Brule, and then most of the others were located, the Hunkpapa were eventually located in the area that's now the Standing Rock Reservation. Most of the other bands were located at the Cheyenne River Agency. Well, in May of 1875, the principal representatives from the bands that were at each of those three agencies traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Grant and his advisors. From the Red Cloud Agency, Red Cloud, and from the Spotted Tail Agency, Spotted Tail, who were both in their early 50s. Both of them had fought, of course, against the U.S. government in Red Cloud's war, but had been very, very important, especially Red Cloud, in the signing of the treaty ending that war at Fort Laramie in 1868. The two of them had met President Grant before in 1871. This time, they were accompanied by kind of an elder presence among the leaders of the Sioux. Lone Horn, who was one of the Minneconjou leaders, who was 85 years old at this time. He was nearing the end of his life. His sons would both be prominent. Touch the Clouds, who would be a close associate of Crazy Horse. And his other son was named Spotted Elk, but much later he was given the nickname by white soldiers Bigfoot. And he would eventually take over leadership of the Minneconjou from Lone Horn when Lone Horn passed away just a couple of years after this in 1877 at Bear Butte of old age. Lone Horn was also the maternal uncle of Crazy Horse, Lone Horn's sister, Rattling Blanket Woman, who, of course, like him, was a Minneconjou, had married an Ogallala man who was also named Crazy Horse, and had a son. Since the Lakota are patrilineal, then his band membership was the Ogallala, not the Minneconjou. So Crazy Horse and Touch the Clouds were very close associates, best friends, really, and they were also cousins. Turns out the U.S. government really, really, really wanted those Black Hills so that Americans could have access to the gold that was there. So they made an offer to these chiefs, offering to buy not just the Black Hills, but all of their uh, all of their land claims. In essence, the entire Great Sioux Reservation, plus all the unceded lands, for $25,000. And in return, why, we'll give you some land in Indian Territory down in Oklahoma, with all the other Indians whose land we have. The chiefs said very emphatically, no, no, thank you at all. In fact, Spotted Tail said, "You speak of another country, but it is not my country. It does not concern me, and I want nothing to do with it. I was not born there. If it is such a good country, you ought to send the white men now in our country there and let us alone." Well, that didn't pan out, but not very likely that the Lakota were going to be left alone. So they returned back to the reservation. The following fall, a delegation came representing the U.S. government once again, offering to buy the Black Hills and everything that went with it, and anything that didn't go with it, just everything. And once again, the Lakota leaders said no. Now, bear in mind, these are the leaders who were on the reservation and who were trying, really, their very best to maintain peaceful relations. But even they were starting to get a little fed up at this point. As one of the chiefs pointed out, when the government representatives were pressuring them yet again to sell their land, "You guaranteed them to us forever, just 7 years ago." In November of 1875, General Sheridan, Lieutenant General Sheridan, and Brigadier General George Crook reported to Washington to meet with President Grant and his cabinet, including the Secretary of War, to discuss what should happen next. And it was decided at that meeting they were no longer going to arrest trespassing miners. They were just going to let them in. And they also decided that the best course of action would be to attack the Lakotas and their allies who were on the unceded lands that winter. The sooner the better, to, quote, whip them into submission. However, they couldn't just, well, they could, but they wanted to at least make some pretense of having a casus belli, a reason for going to war. So they sent a message to the government agents at the various Indian agencies on the Great Sioux Reservation, telling them that the negotiations of the previous month had been essentially undoable because everyone wasn't there. All the chiefs had not come onto the reservation for the negotiations. Therefore, the agents were told they needed to get word to all the Lakotas who were out there in the unceded territory that they needed, and this was sent out in December, that they needed to get to the reservation by the end of January. Now, this was a tall order because winter was well underway, and winters are pretty rough up there in the northern plains. In fact, the government representative at the Standing Rock Agency complained. He said that he needed that deadline extended because it would be virtually impossible for those native people who were out there to the west of the reservation to get all their stuff together and to make it through the bad weather and the wintry storms to make it to the reservation. And he was told that no such deadline deadline extension would be allowed. And he wasn't told this, but essentially that's because this was just an excuse. They knew that the various bands wouldn't be able to make it in, even if they wanted to. And in reality, they didn't want to. Some of them thought about it, and in fact had decided, well, as soon as the weather gets better, we'll go do that. But weather's not going to get better in January. So when that deadline came and went, and Sitting Bull and the other various leaders who were out there in the unceded lands had not shown up, then the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Smith, wrote that, quote, "Without the receipt of any news of Sitting Bull's submission, I see no reason why, in the discretion of the Honorable Secretary of War, military operations against him should not commence at once." And those were the orders that were given. It came down the line to General Sheridan, Lieutenant General Sheridan, on February 8th, a little over a week after the deadline had passed. He telegraphed Brigadier Generals Crook and Terry under his command to begin their winter campaign against, quote, "the hostiles." And so they did. And the Great Sioux War was on. By the way, I put together this handy-dandy little chart for you. I'll be doing the same thing for the other side, just so you can keep straight who's who. Particularly these next few minutes in this lecture, but any extra reading you ever want to do about Custer and the Great Sioux War and Sitting Bull, you're going to come across these names, a whole bunch of different generals and colonels, kind of hard to keep straight, especially since all the colonels used to be generals in the Civil War, and most of the colonels will be generals again. So it can be a little confusing. So I've got kind of a chain of command here, and I even went so far to help you out in case you don't know your military ranks, to have the stars there for the generals so you can tell, who is starrier than the others. By the way, the two of the colonels on the bottom, Ronald McKenzie, good old bad hand that we've already talked about, and Nelson Miles, both of whom were called up after having just spent the last couple of years fighting Comanches and Kiowas in the Southern Plains. Both these guys were in competition to see who would get promoted to brigadier general first. And the joke always was that even though McKenzie was probably, the most capable colonel, the most capable regimental commander out there, Miles had better connections and was almost surely going to get promoted first. And so people used to say that McKenzie has Miles between him and his star. All right, well, William Tecumseh Sherman, right up there at the top, general, 4 stars, full general, in command of the entire U.S. Army. Philip Sheridan, 3-star general, in command of the Department of the West. Now, once this war gets started, the plan, the strategy is going to be to have 3 different columns led by each of these 3 guys in the middle row, Brigadier Generals Crook and Terry and Colonel Gibbon. Joseph Reynolds and Ronald McKenzie, both cavalry regimental commanders serving under Crook. George Armstrong Custer, lieutenant colonel, serves under Terry, so he's part of Terry's column. Nelson Miles gets called in partway into this war to replace General Custer. I'm sorry, not General Custer anymore, he's a colonel. To replace Custer, spoiler alert, Custer's going to need to be replaced. By the way, I just tripped myself up, and it's easy to do, especially if you're reading accounts from the time, because all the colonels that used to be generals were generally referred to as generals still, even though they were colonels out of courtesy. Anyway, that gets us to the beginning point of where Crook and Terry, and then shortly to be joined by Gibbon, start moving toward the Lakota and their Northern Cheyenne allies, and a small number of Northern Arapaho, I think, with them as well.